Shana Tova and Shabbat Shalom. Many of you may recall that my article in the September newsletter talked about uncomfortableness and being uncomfortable during this holiday season. And I must say that I'm a little uncomfortable giving my Devar Torah, talking just to my iPhone up in the loft rather than speaking to all of you in shul. But we knew that it was going to be an uncomfortable holiday. You may recall that I also mentioned in the newsletter article that this is really a central theme of the Torah readings for both the first and the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Both of them are difficult to read and difficult to make sense of, and even more difficult to understand why it would be that the rabbis would want us to read these Torah readings on days when a lot of people would be exposed to them. Very important days of heightened spirituality. The first day, of course, dealing with not just the birth of Isaac, but also the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Very, very difficult stuff. And then, of course, on the second day, the Akedat Yitzchak, the near sacrifice of Isaac. I want to focus on the first story, though, the story of the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael from Sarah and Abraham's home. This is a story which the rabbis felt compelled to write a lot of midrashim about, to give a lot of explanations about. And whenever they do that, it's most likely because they are also finding it to be a difficult text. It's something that they sense that there's a little bit something wrong with it. And even if you look at the text itself, you'll see that there's nothing really wrong with Hagar or nothing really wrong with Ishmael, but the rabbis afterwards in Midrashim have to impute all kinds of negative connotations to both of them in order to make Sarah and Abraham's actions look acceptable. About a week or two ago, there was an article from the Huffington Post in 2013 by Rabbi Danya Rutenberg that dealt with this exact issue. And she said that we have to look at the story in an honest way and accept that what we're seeing here is really Sarah and Abraham not at their best. What we recognize from the story is a woman who has power, Sarah, manipulating a woman who is powerless, Hagar. And this is a woman who is disempowered and should have a greater place, a place of equality. She was, after all, the mother of Abraham's first son. And yet there are politics involved, and we see abuses of power. There are many different ways to read the story, according to the article, but I think the main point that Rabbi Rutenberg is trying to get us to see is that we should read this story in a way that is intellectually honest. We should face the truth of what happens in this story and understand that it's not a nice story. It is an uncomfortable story. We also, one of the interesting things that Danya Rutenberg mentions is that Sarah seems to get her comeuppance, of course, after the near sacrifice of Isaac. The very next thing that we hear is that Sarah has died. And there are interpretations that say that she simply died when she had heard what almost happened to her son Isaac, and perhaps, as it is suggested by Rabbi Rutenberg, perhaps she understood for the first time what it was like for Hagar to be in a position of almost losing her son as well, and that overwhelming guilt, maybe that's what brought upon the death of our matriarch Sarah. An interesting way to look at it, but again, we can't gloss over the fact that this is a very difficult passage in our Torah. So why is this included on Rosh Hashanah, and in particular on the first day of Rosh Hashanah? Certainly this Torah reading is, or at least the story of Hagar and Ishmael being tossed out, is towards the end of the reading. At the beginning we have the birth of Isaac, and we know that this is selected because it begins with the words that God remembered Sarah, and of course Rosh Hashanah is a day of remembrance. I believe that the rabbis also wanted us to study this text and include the ending part because we do have to look at the story seriously. We have to look at it in an honest way. And one of the things that we do, or we should be doing on Rosh Hashanah, is taking a look at ourselves, our own actions, and our own souls, and we should be plumbing those depths as well. We should be digging deep. We should be scratching beneath the surface, not just looking at the nice part of the story, right? The part where Isaac is born, right? But to look at every part of our story throughout our lives, but in particular in the last year. This is, of course, not a comfortable thing to do. We don't like to think about the ways in which we came up short. It's not something that is spiritually fulfilling. It's actually distressing. It's uncomfortable. But that is one of the things that our tradition tells us on an annual basis we have to do. And ultimately, we can't really move forward as human beings. We can't fully improve ourselves unless we're willing to face our past honestly. Anyone who's ever had any familiarity or been in psychotherapy knows that this is one of the main parts of getting better is to understand honestly the past and to try to understand what our motives have been, what other people's motives have been, how we react, how we act in certain situations. And this is certainly one of the things that we need to do on Rosh Hashanah. We need to look at ourselves honestly. We need to understand ourselves before we can go ahead and make the positive changes that are necessary. So this whole idea of facing the past honestly is, of course, an idea that is throughout Judaism, and in particular, one that we hear an awful lot about with regard to the Holocaust. Some of you may have seen an article that, or actually an opinion piece that appeared in Bloomberg News back in June, which discussed the history of confronting the Holocaust in Germany. And there have been a lot of articles about this, but we all know that Germany really after the war was forced to take a look at what it had done. It was forced to confront the horrors that had been committed by the Nazi leadership. And over the years, there have been many different ways in which that facing the past has become a part of the national psyche in Germany, including those stumbling stones. If any of you have ever visited Germany, there are these stones that stick out from the sidewalk that mark places where either people had been killed or people who were killed in the Holocaust had lived. And you literally stumble over them, so that there's always this presence or reminder of what had happened in Germany. Germany was really forced to take a look at what it had done, and that's why in Germany there is such a strong aversion to anti-Semitism. Even though yes, there are far right-wingers, but they've never really been able to catch any kind of traction. If you take a look at a neighboring country like Austria, which hasn't been forced to deal with it, there's a much bigger problem with anti-Semitism in there. And again, I think the difference is really, have we been forced to deal with something or not? Right? The Germans were forced after the war to do it, whereas in Austria there was more of a, well, we were victims too. This is also the case in a few other countries, in Poland and Ukraine, where people, rather than honestly looking at the role that they played in the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, just simply cast themselves in the role of being victims. And that's why anti-Semitism is persistent in these countries, because there wasn't a real attempt to honestly look at the role that people had played. And as long as that doesn't happen, anti-Semitism is going to continue to fester. We need those people who were responsible for the Holocaust, even though they may not be around, at least they're the descendants in the nation in which that kind of thing was allowed to happen, need to understand, acknowledge their role, and atone for what they had done. Now, this is, I think, an especially poignant message for us on Rosh Hashanah, but in particular, given what's been going on in this country. In the last several months since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we have seen a lot of racial issues come to the fore. And for many of us, we've been exposed to stories and issues about which we're simply not aware, because we don't live those. My life, even as a Jew, as a white man, I don't come up against many of the things that people of color come up against. I don't even begin to try to understand all of those things. But we as a country in general, I would say, are sort of in that same mix, that we haven't fully or honestly dealt with how this country was built, that for the first several centuries of this country's existence, this country was built on the backs of people who were paid nothing. It was built on the backs of slaves. They built this country for free. And even those of us whose ancestors arrived many hundreds of years later, or 50 years after the end of slavery even, we still benefit from a nation that was built by people who were disempowered and who were enslaved. We have not sufficiently as a country dealt with the inconsistencies of the founding fathers and the principles that they established. Wonderful, beautiful principles like all men are created equal, except, right? Or people like George Washington who owned slaves. We haven't really dealt with what does that mean for us, and how do we relate to these people, and what places of honor do we give them or don't we? It may be true that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, but the legacy of what has happened in this country has not fully been dealt with, and that's why things didn't simply change overnight after the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's because many people believe, and I think there is something to this, that we as a country have not fully atoned for what it meant to have enslaved so many people for so many centuries. And I believe that's a big reason why we are dealing with the issues that we are dealing with in our country today. So where do we go from here? How do we begin that process of atoning? I think the most important thing, and this is nothing new, I've mentioned this before, is to hear the stories, to educate ourselves. The government and the people of this country, including, again, those of us who have arrived later, we need to understand what was done to people and the possible role that each of us has played in perpetuating systems that have continued to keep certain people down and keep other people in positions of power. I know a lot of people get very uncomfortable with the organization Black Lives Matter, and I understand where that comes from. But we have to understand that perfect is the enemy of the good. If we look for a perfect group with which we can work, or a perfect situation in which to act, we're never going to find it. We'll never do it. And so we have to work in imperfect ways, and as we do it, try to educate other people about our situation as well. But certainly the issue that is on fire right now is the way that African Americans and other people of color have been treated so terribly and with such injustice in our country. It's something that we need to deal with. It's just too important for the future of our nation. And for the Jewish community as well, we have a lot at stake here for us to simply say, we're not going to be a part of this because there's a small section of it that is anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. There are certainly people with whom we can work. There are partners with whom we can find ways to make progress together. Of course, this is going to be uncomfortable. It's not easy, nor is it fun for us to take a look back at these years in our history and to also understand what we may possibly be doing to perpetuate injustice. This doesn't make us feel good. It's uncomfortable. But as I said before, that's part of Judaism. We're not supposed to be comfortable. We're supposed to feel that sense of something not being right, and that's supposed to impel us to become better people. Many of you have over the years studied Maimonides' Hilchot Shuvah, the laws of repentance. One of the things that Maimonides talks about is the process of redemption, how that has to take place. And there are a number of different steps. But one of the things that he says is that we simply cannot atone for what we have done until we admit, we make a verbal confession, which is what we do on Yom Kippur. We do not admit what we have done. And I believe as a nation, we haven't fully admitted what we have done to people of color. Then we have to try to make it right. And then we have to take the actions that will prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Our work is certainly cut out for us as a nation, and it's not going to be comfortable. And it should be a reminder to us on this first day of Rosh Hashanah of the discomfort that we should feel ourselves as we try to work on our own personal atonement. But if we work on our own personal atonement and we don't think about the atonement of the larger society in which we live, I believe that we truly miss the point and that we don't fully reach the atonement that Maimonides was talking about until we take a look out around us and we see a world in which those injustices no longer exist and can't even imagine a way in which those injustices would be perpetrated again in the future. Until we do that, we cannot consider ourselves as individuals, as a community, and as a nation as having fully repented. May God give us the strength, the courage, and the ability to get through the discomfort so that next year we can look back and say we have made grand steps towards atonement. Again, Shana Tova and Shabbat Shalom.